Get him out of my sight.
Those 5 careless words didn't just end a conversation. They detonated Eleanor Drake's entire world, her company, her reputation, and the $350 million lifeline she was desperate to secure. Because the man she dismissed as a nobody was the anonymous investor she'd been waiting for, and he had just seen exactly who she was when she thought no one important was watching. Welcome to Golden Heart Stories. This is the story of how one moment of arrogance echoed through an entire year. The morning light filtered through the glass facade of the Grand Langston Hotel, casting shadows across the polished marble floor. Eleanor Drake stepped through the revolving doors, with the decisive stride of someone accustomed to owning every room she entered. Her charcoal suit was impeccable, her heels clicking in a rhythm that announced authority. She had 12 minutes before the most important meeting of her career. Nova Gene Systems was hemorrhaging cash, and this mysterious investor represented her last option. Everything had to be perfect. Her gaze swept across the lobby. The reserved corner table gleamed under pendant lighting, already set with water glasses and leather folders, exactly as ordered. But then her eyes caught something that shattered her satisfaction. A man stood near the table, not seated, not waiting with purpose, just standing there, hands in the pockets of faded jeans, a simple button-down shirt rolled to the elbows. His posture was casual, as if he had wandered in from a coffee shop. Rather than prepared for a serious negotiation, Eleanor's jaw tightened. She changed direction without hesitation, crossing the lobby. The distance collapsed in seconds. When she stopped, her shadow fell across him. "Excuse me." Her voice was sharp, slicing through the ambient murmur of the lobby with surgical precision. "Why are you lingering near my private meeting area? This table is reserved for a critical business meeting." The man blinked, his expression shifting from neutral to mildly curious. There was no alarm in his eyes, no immediate deference. That absence of reaction intensified Eleanor's annoyance. He opened his mouth to speak, his tone measured. "Good morning. I'm Mark, and I believe there might be some confusion here." I don't care who you are or what you believe." Eleanor cut him off with the precision of someone who had silenced countless voices in boardrooms. Her hand gestured dismissively toward the entrance. "This is a reserved space for business discussions. Whatever you're selling, whatever angle you're working, I'm not interested. If you're trying to solicit something, you're wasting your time and mine. Do you understand?" He paused, his eyes steady on hers. "I understand perfectly, but if you'd just let me explain." "Explain?" Eleanor's voice rose slightly. "You shouldn't even be standing here. This is inappropriate, unprofessional. I have investors arriving any minute, and I will not have this meeting compromised by someone who doesn't belong here." Around them, the lobby's ambient noise dimmed. Heads turned. A woman near the concierge desk lifted her phone, angling it toward the confrontation. Another guest paused mid-stride, fingers swiping across a screen. Mark noticed the phones, his gaze flickering to the growing audience. But he made no move to defend himself. Eleanor's pulse quickened with righteous certainty. She turned toward the front desk, her voice rising just enough to carry authority across the cavernous space without seeming to shout. "Security. I need someone to escort this man outside immediately." 2 uniformed guards approached within moments, their expressions professional but wary. One addressed Mark with polite formality. "Sir, we'll need you to come with us. Please don't make this difficult." Mark's shoulders rose and fell in a quiet exhale. When he spoke, his voice carried no edge. "I understand. There's no need for difficulty. I'll go peacefully." The second guard gestured toward the exit. "This way, sir." "Of course," Mark replied, his tone almost gentle. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, his movements unhurried. As the guards guided him toward the exit, his footsteps were soft against the marble. But as they reached the revolving doors, he turned his head. His eyes found Eleanor's across the lobby, and for a long moment, he simply looked at her. The morning light caught his face. There was no rage in his gaze, no wounded pride, just a calm, penetrating observation, as if he were committing every detail of her expression to memory. The way her chin jutted forward, the way her fingers curled at her sides, the faint crease between her brows, that betrayed more tension than she intended to show. He studied it all with the patience of someone who had time. Then he turned away and stepped into the revolving door. The sidewalk crowd swallowed him within seconds. His casual clothes blending into the flow of pedestrians. Eleanor stood frozen for a beat longer than she meant to, her breath caught somewhere between triumph and an inexplicable unease. Around her, phones were lowering. Whispers began to circulate. She forced herself to turn back toward the reserved table, smoothing her jacket with a sharp tug, reclaiming the composure that had slipped. But the feeling lingered, the way he had looked at her, the way he had studied her face as if cataloging something important. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. He was nobody, a random distraction. She had an investor to meet, and nothing else mattered. The morning light continued to stream through the glass, indifferent to the collision that had just occurred beneath it. The glass walls of Nova Gene Systems headquarters reflected the afternoon sun, but inside Eleanor's corner office, the light felt cold. She sat behind her desk, fingers pressed against her temples, staring at the financial statements spread before her. The numbers glared back in merciless black and red ink. 8 weeks. That was all they had left. 8 weeks before the company she had built would start missing payroll, defaulting on contracts, collapsing. Her chest tightened as she recalculated the projections for the third time. The math didn't change. The door opened without a knock. Richard Chen, her chief financial officer, entered with the grim expression of a doctor delivering terminal news. He carried a tablet clutched against his chest like a shield, his knuckles white around the edges. Eleanor looked up, her jaw already clenched in anticipation. "Tell me something good, Richard." Her voice was flat, drained of the authority she had wielded so easily that morning. Richard set the tablet on her desk, the screen displaying a list of names investors they had courted for months. Each name had a red X beside it. "I wish I could." Wellington Group passed this morning. Citadel Fund sent their formal decline an hour ago. Quantum Ventures won't even return calls. He paused, his finger hovering over the last name on the list. "The only meeting that's still standing is the one from this morning. The anonymous investor. They haven't cancelled yet." Eleanor's hands dropped from her temples to the desk, her palms flat against the polished wood. The anonymous investor. The meeting she had been rushing toward when she encountered that man in the lobby. The meeting that never happened because she had spent 20 minutes in the hotel bathroom, hands trembling, trying to compose herself after security escorted him out. By the time she returned to the lobby, the reserved table was empty. "Anonymous," she repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. "We're betting the company's survival on someone who won't even give us a name? At this point, we don't have the luxury of being selective." Richard's voice carried an edge she rarely heard from him. "Everyone else has already said no." Eleanor pushed back from her desk, the chair rolling sharply against the window behind her. She stood abruptly, her body coiled with barely contained frustration. Without another word, she swept past Richard and into the hallway, her heels striking the tile floor with aggressive percussion. Employees glanced up from their workstations as she passed, then quickly looked away, sensing the storm brewing in her wake. "These incompetent financiers," she muttered, her voice rising as she walked. "They can't see innovation when it's staring them in the face. They want guarantees, safety, predictability. They wouldn't recognize real disruption if it burned down their portfolios." A junior analyst froze mid-stride near the break room, coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. A project manager ducked into a conference room, suddenly fascinated by something on the wall. The tension rippled through the open floor plan like a physical force. Employees shrinking into their cubicles as Eleanor's tirade echoed off the glass partitions. 12 years of work, she continued, addressing no one and everyone simultaneously. 12 years of bleeding-edge research, and they're too scared to back real innovation. Cowards hiding behind risk assessments and quarterly projections. In the executive boardroom, 3 members of Novagene's board sat in uncomfortable silence, watching Eleanor's progress through the office via the transparent walls. Margaret Soto, the longest-serving board member, exchanged glances with the others, her lips pressed into a thin line. "She's spiraling," whispered David Ortega, the board's legal counsel. His hands were folded on the conference table, his expression troubled. "This is the third outburst this week." Margaret leaned forward, her voice low but firm. The question we need to ask ourselves is whether Eleanor Drake is still the right person to lead this company through a crisis. Leadership requires stability, judgment, emotional control. What we're seeing out there. She gestured toward the office floor where Eleanor had disappeared around a corner. That's not leadership. That's desperation. She built this company, countered Thomas Way, the newest board member. But even his defense sounded hollow, obligatory rather than convinced. And she may be the one who destroys it, Margaret replied. Her words hung in the air like a sentence already passed, waiting only for execution. Back in her office, Eleanor stood at the window overlooking the city, her reflection ghostly against the glass. Richard had followed at a cautious distance, hovering near the doorway. She could feel his presence, his concern, his judgment. We can fix this, she said, her voice suddenly calm, almost eerily so. The shift was so abrupt it made Richard stiffen. I can fix this. By Friday, we'll have new commitments. New capital. New momentum. Eleanor, Richard began, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. By Friday, Richard. I just need until Friday. Everything will be different. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, and in that moment, even she wasn't sure if she believed her own words. But belief didn't matter anymore. Survival was the only currency that counted, and the meter was running out. The penthouse occupied the 42nd floor of a steel and glass tower in Chicago's financial district. Its windows offering an unobstructed view of the city below. Evening light filtered through the space, casting shadows across minimalist furniture and polished floors. Mark Rowan stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, as a voice emanated from the ceiling speakers. The analyst's recorded report was clinical, methodical. Employee turnover in the past 18 months has increased by 47%. Exit interviews consistently cite leadership style as a primary factor. Middle management reports feeling undervalued and dismissed. Mark's expression remained unreadable, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't move, simply absorbed the information. The analyst's voice continued, cataloging the fractures within Novagene's culture with precision. Communications from the chief executive officer demonstrate patterns of dismissiveness. There are documented instances of public criticism that employees describe as demoralizing. The recording ended with a soft click. Mark turned to a sleek desk where a laptop sat open, its screen glowing. He tapped a key, and footage from the Grand Langston Hotel began to play. There he was, standing near the reserved table, and there was Eleanor Drake approaching. Mark leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he watched. The audio quality was clear, capturing every word. Eleanor's voice cut through the speakers. Why are you lingering near my private meeting area? This table is reserved for a critical business meeting. Mark watched his own image on screen, saw himself attempt to introduce himself, only to be cut off. He observed Eleanor's gestures, the dismissive wave of her hand, the way her voice rose as she summoned security. His face on screen remained calm, but here in the penthouse, something flickered behind his eyes, not anger, but cold assessment. Whatever you're selling, whatever angle you're working, I'm not interested, Eleanor's recorded voice declared. If you're trying to solicit something, you're wasting your time and mine. Mark paused the footage on a frame that captured Eleanor's face in profile, her jaw set, her expression hard. He studied it for a long moment, his fingers drumming once against the desk before falling still. The door opened, and a woman in her early 30s entered carrying a tablet. Jennifer Park, his executive assistant, moved with quiet efficiency. She stopped a respectful distance from the desk, waiting. Mark glanced up, acknowledging her with a slight nod. The Innovation Fund paperwork is ready for your signature, Jennifer said, her tone professional but not cold. $600 million pending your authorization. The investment committee has delegated full discretionary authority to you on allocation decisions. Mark straightened, his hands sliding into his pockets as he considered the tablet. $600 million. The kind of capital that could resurrect a dying company or be deployed elsewhere. The power to decide sat entirely in his hands. And the Novagene proposal? He asked, his voice measured. Still under consideration per your instructions. No commitments have been made. The window for decision closes Friday. Jennifer's eyes flicked toward the frozen image on the laptop, then back to Mark. Do you need additional time to evaluate? Mark walked back to the window, his silhouette framed against the darkening sky. The city lights were beginning to sparkle below. He stood there for what felt like minutes. "Continue the evaluation," he said finally, his tone offering no explanation. No reasoning, no glimpse into the calculations running behind his carefully neutral expression. Jennifer nodded, making a note on her tablet. She knew better than to press for details when Mark used that particular tone. "Understood. Anything else you need this evening?" "No, that's all." She left as quietly as she had entered, the door clicking shut. Mark remained at the window, but his attention shifted to a small side table near the wall. A silver frame sat there, containing a photograph that seemed out of place in the modern severity of the penthouse. He crossed to the table and picked up the frame, his fingers careful against the cool metal. The photograph showed a woman in her 50s, wearing a factory uniform, her face lined with fatigue but her eyes bright. His mother. She stood outside a manufacturing plant, her lunch pail in hand. Mark's thumb traced the edge of the frame as memories surfaced, her stories of being passed over for promotions, of being spoken to as if her opinions carried no weight, of fighting for dignity in spaces that offered none. She had never complained, not really, but he had seen the toll it took. He set the photograph back on the table, positioning it carefully. His expression remained unreadable, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The hotel footage, the analyst's report, the $600 million waiting for his decision, all of it connected in ways that only he fully understood. The city lights glittered below, indifferent to the judgments being formed 42 floors above. The notification arrived on Eleanor's phone at 3:47 in the afternoon. A tagged mention on social media. She glanced at the screen while reviewing projections, her thumb swiping to dismiss it. But the preview text made her freeze. CEO humiliates man in lobby. Her chest constricted. She tapped the notification, and the screen filled with a video clip that had already accumulated thousands of views. There she was, standing in the Grand Langston Hotel lobby, her voice sharp even through the phone speaker. The footage captured everything: her dismissive gestures, the way she summoned security, the casual cruelty in her tone. The comments scrolled beneath like a jury rendering verdicts. Eleanor's hands began to tremble as she watched the view count climb in real time. Within 20 minutes, her assistant knocked, her face pale. "Eleanor, Wellington Group just cancelled. They said they're withdrawing due to concerns about leadership culture." Eleanor looked up sharply. "What? They confirmed yesterday. What changed?" The assistant's eyes flicked toward Eleanor's phone, the answer unspoken but clear. Eleanor felt heat crawl up her neck. She set the phone face down on her desk. 45 minutes later, another cancellation arrived via email. Citadel Fund, their message clinical. "After careful review of recent developments, we have decided to pursue other opportunities." The corporate euphemisms barely masked the real message. By 5 o'clock, Quantum Ventures had joined the exodus, their cancellation delivered through an automated system without even a phone call. Eleanor sat behind her desk, staring at the string of rejections. The company had 8 weeks of liquidity, and in 2 hours, every remaining investor prospect had evaporated. Her phone lit up with an incoming call, the board chair's number. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly before answering. "Eleanor." Margaret Soto's voice was controlled but tight. "We need to talk. Now. I'm convening an emergency board call in 15 minutes, and your presence is mandatory." The line went dead. Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair rolling backward. 15 minutes to prepare for what would surely be an interrogation. The video conference began precisely on time, 6 board members appearing on her monitor. Their faces ranged from concerned to openly hostile. Margaret spoke first. "Eleanor, I assume you've seen the video circulating online. We need clarity immediately. Who was the man in the hotel lobby? Why did you have him removed? And what impact is this having on our fundraising efforts?" Eleanor's throat felt tight. She forced confidence into her voice. "The incident has been taken out of context. I was protecting a confidential business meeting. The man was loitering near a reserved space, and I made a judgment call." 3 investors canceled today, David Ortega interjected. All within hours of that video going viral. "That's not coincidence, Eleanor. That's consequence." Who was he? The question hung in the digital air. Eleanor's mind raced backward through the encounter, searching for details she had dismissed. The man had tried to introduce himself. He had said his name. Mark something. Just Mark. No last name. No business card. I don't have his full identity yet, she admitted. But I'm working to establish that information. You don't know? Margaret's voice rose slightly. Eleanor, you had a man escorted out by security. And you don't even know who he was? This is exactly the kind of impulsive decision-making we've been concerned about. I'll have the information shortly, Eleanor said, her voice hardening. This is being handled. The situation, Thomas Way said quietly, is that we're hemorrhaging investor confidence at exactly the moment we can least afford it. The call ended with terse instructions to provide a full report within 24 hours. The rectangles disappeared, leaving Eleanor staring at her own reflection in the darkened screen. She pressed the intercom button. Sarah, get in here. Now. Her assistant appeared within seconds, tablet in hand. Eleanor stood, pacing behind her desk, her movements sharp and agitated. I need you to contact the Grand Langston Hotel immediately. Get the security footage from this morning. Get the guest registry. Get anything that identifies the man I had removed from the lobby. I need a name, a company, a background. Everything. The hotel may not release that information without. I don't care what it takes. Eleanor's voice cut through the objection. Offer them money. Threaten legal action if necessary. Use whatever leverage we have. But I need that information today. Not tomorrow. Today. Do you understand? Sarah nodded, her fingers already moving across the tablet. I'll make it happen. As the door closed, Eleanor returned to the window, her hands pressed against the cool glass. Somewhere in this city, the man from the lobby existed, completely unaware of the chaos his brief encounter had unleashed. Or perhaps he was very aware. She had never even learned his name, and now that ignorance threatened to cost her everything. The Grand Langston Hotel's administrative offices occupied a corridor behind the main lobby. Eleanor sat across from the security manager, her hands folded on the table, her jaw set with barely masked desperation. The man, whose nameplate read, Thomas Rivera, regarded her with practiced neutrality. I understand your position, Miss Drake, he said, his tone immovable. However, hotel policy prohibits releasing guest information without proper legal authorization. Eleanor leaned forward. I'm not asking for the entire registry. Just one name. One man who was in your lobby this morning. Rivera's expression didn't shift. The policy exists for a reason. I'm afraid I can't help you. The refusal landed like a physical blow. Eleanor stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly. Eleanor left the office, her heels striking the floor sharply. She was halfway to the exit when a voice called out hesitantly. Excuse me, Miss Drake? Eleanor turned to find a young woman in hotel uniform, her hands twisting nervously around a tablet. I couldn't help overhearing, the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. The gentleman from this morning checked in under a corporate block funded by Rowan Capital. Eleanor's breath caught. Rowan Capital? The woman nodded quickly, already backing away. That's all I know. Before Eleanor could press for more, the staff member disappeared. Eleanor pulled out her phone, fingers moving rapidly, searching. The results materialized within seconds. Rowan Capital, headquartered in Chicago. One of the largest biomedical investment firms in the country. And there, buried in the leadership section, she found him. Mark Rowan, Chief Executive Officer. The photograph showed the same face from the lobby, though here he wore a tailored suit. Eleanor's stomach dropped as the full weight of her mistake crystallized. She had dismissed him as a nobody, treated him like an annoyance, had him physically removed by security. And he was one of the most powerful investors in her industry. Her hands began to shake. She sat down heavily on a bench near the entrance, staring at the phone screen. Chicago. He was based in Chicago. She could be there tonight. The decision formed before rational thought could intervene. Eleanor opened her airline app, fingers trembling as she booked the last seat on the 11:30 flight to O'Hare. She didn't tell Richard, didn't inform the board. She simply moved, driven by urgency that overrode every other consideration. The flight departed on schedule, the cabin lights dimmed for the night journey. Eleanor sat in seat 14A, forehead pressed against the cool window, watching Seattle's lights fade beneath clouds. The encounter replayed in her mind with excruciating clarity now. Her voice, sharp and dismissive. "I don't care who you are or what you believe." The way she had gestured toward the exit as if he were trash to be removed. "Whatever you're selling, whatever angle you're working, I'm not interested." She had been openly hostile, her tone dripping with condescension. He had tried to explain. She remembered that now. He had started to introduce himself properly, and she had cut him off, refused to listen, summoned security before he could finish a sentence. The shame of it burned through her chest. The flight attendant passed with a beverage cart, but Eleanor waved her away, too consumed by regret to think about refreshment. She closed her eyes, but sleep was impossible. The darkness only made the memories more vivid. The plane touched down at O'Hare at 2:47 in the morning Chicago time. Eleanor moved through the airport in a haze of exhaustion and adrenaline, collecting her carry-on, finding a taxi in the pre-dawn darkness. She gave the driver the address she had memorized, and they drove through empty streets where streetlights cast orange glow on wet pavement. Rowan Capital's headquarters occupied a modern glass tower in the financial district, its facade reflecting the first hints of approaching dawn. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk looking up at the building, her breath visible in the cold air. The lobby would be locked. Security would question her presence. She had no appointment, no invitation, no reasonable explanation for appearing before sunrise. But she had come this far. Turning back was no longer an option. She approached the revolving door and found it locked. Through the glass, she could see a security desk where a lone guard sat reading something on a tablet. Eleanor knocked on the glass, the sound sharp in the silence. The guard looked up, startled, then rose and approached with obvious skepticism. "We open at 8, he called through the glass. Eleanor pressed her business card against the window. "My name is Eleanor Drake. I'm the CEO of Nova Gene Systems. I need to request an unscheduled meeting with Mr. Rowan. It's urgent." The guard studied her through the glass, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he unlocked the door and let her into the lobby, where she stood shivering slightly in her travel-wrinkled suit, knowing she looked desperate because she was. "I'll make a call," he said. "But I can't promise anything at this hour." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She had flown through the night to confront the consequences of her arrogance, and now all she could do was wait. The Rowan Capital lobby stretched before Eleanor like a cathedral of glass and steel. She approached the reception desk where two women sat behind sleek monitors, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to sudden recognition as she gave her name. The transformation was unmistakable, eyebrows rising, glances exchanged with shared knowledge. "Eleanor Drake," she repeated, her voice steadier than she felt. "CEO of Nova Gene Systems. I'm here to request a meeting with Mr. Rowan." The younger receptionist leaned toward her colleague, her hand covering her mouth as she whispered something Eleanor couldn't hear. But she saw the knowing look, the way both women's eyes flicked back to her face. They had seen the video. "Please have a seat," the older receptionist said, her tone professional but cool. "Someone will be with you shortly." Eleanor turned away, her legs unsteady as she crossed to a waiting area with stiff leather benches. She lowered herself onto one, the leather creaking, and folded her hands to keep them from shaking. The lobby was warming, but she still felt cold. Minutes crawled past. The building began to wake, elevator doors chiming open to release employees with coffee cups. Eleanor kept her eyes downward, but she could feel the glances. A man in a charcoal suit paused near reception, his conversation punctuated by a glance in her direction. A woman with a portfolio actually stopped mid-stride when she recognized Eleanor, her mouth forming a small circle before she hurried away. Each recognition felt like a fresh wound. Eleanor's shoulders hunched inward, her anxiety built with each passing employee, her heart rate climbing until she could hear the pulse in her ears. An hour passed, then another. The leather bench grew harder, her back aching. She shifted positions, but nothing helped. The waiting room had no clock, no indication of time except the flow of employees who continued to notice her, continued to whisper. Two young women emerged from an elevator, both wearing ID badges. They moved toward the coffee station, their voices carrying clearly. "Did you hear Mark is making his final decision on the Nova Gene proposal today?" one of them said, stirring sugar into her coffee. The other woman nodded. I heard it's been under evaluation for weeks. Apparently, there were concerns about leadership culture. $600 million riding on one decision. Eleanor's breath caught, her hands clenching until her knuckles went white. The Nova Jean proposal. Mark's final decision. Today. She had come here hoping to apologize, to explain, to somehow salvage a relationship that might save her company. But if Mark was making his final decision today, her presence here might already be too late. The two women moved away. Eleanor sat frozen on the leather bench, her breathing shallow. 3 hours. She had been sitting here for 3 hours. The rational part of her mind suggested leaving, returning to Seattle, accepting defeat. But she couldn't move. Leaving would mean admitting the fight was over. The elevator doors opened, and a man in his 40s emerged, carrying a tablet. He scanned the lobby, his gaze landing on Eleanor with immediate recognition. He approached with measured steps. Miss Drake? His voice was professional, carefully modulated. I'm David Cho, Director of Operations. Mr. Rowan has been informed of your presence. He may be able to see you for a brief audience, but I can't make guarantees about timing or duration. Eleanor stood so quickly the leather bench creaked. Thank you. I'll wait as long as necessary. David nodded once, his eyes assessing her. Follow me, please. He led her to a bank of elevators, pressing the call button. They rode up in silence, the elevator's smooth ascent making Eleanor's stomach drop. When the doors opened, David guided her down a carpeted hallway to a conference room whose door stood slightly ajar. Wait here, he said. Mr. Rowan will join you shortly. Eleanor entered the conference room, and David closed the door with a soft click that sounded unnaturally loud. The room was dim, lit only by ambient light filtering through frosted glass panels. A long conference table dominated the center, surrounded by leather chairs. Eleanor remained standing, too nervous to sit. She rehearsed an apology in her mind, trying out different phrases. Mr. Rowan, I deeply regret my behavior. Too formal. Mark, I need to apologize for what happened. Too familiar. I was wrong, and I'm here to make it right. Too vague. Nothing sounded adequate. Nothing felt like it could bridge the gap between the person she had been in that hotel lobby and the person she needed to be now. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the conference table, trying to steady herself. The wood was cool and smooth under her palms. She took a deep breath, then another, attempting to slow her racing heart. Somewhere in this building, Mark Rowan was deciding whether to grant her an audience, whether to listen to her apology, whether to consider any kind of mercy for the company hemorrhaging its last resources back in Seattle. The door handle turned, and Eleanor straightened instinctively, her whole body tensing as she prepared to face the consequences of her arrogance. The conference room door swung open, and Eleanor's breath caught. Mark Rowan entered with calm assurance, his footsteps measured. He wore a navy suit, his appearance transformed from the casual figure she had dismissed into something far more formidable. He didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he moved to the head of the table where a laptop sat open, documents spread in neat stacks. Eleanor's stomach dropped as she recognized Novagene's internal letterhead, financial projections, performance reviews she thought were confidential. Mark settled into his chair, his fingers steepling briefly. The silence stretched between them. Eleanor remained standing, hands clenched. The power dynamic was brutally clear. Finally, Mark looked up, his gaze meeting hers with intensity. Miss Drake, he said, his voice level. I'm Mark Rowan, Chief Executive Officer of Rowan Capital. We're the largest biomedical investment firm in the country. Eleanor's throat felt like sandpaper. I know who you are. I should have known in the lobby. Mark raised one hand. Let me finish. Nova Jean submitted a funding proposal 6 weeks ago. The science is impressive, but we don't invest in paper. We invest in people. Leadership determines success or failure. Eleanor gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady herself. I traveled to Seattle personally, Mark continued, his tone calm, to conduct what we call a field evaluation. When we're considering a $600 million investment, I prefer to see leadership in action myself. Unscripted, under pressure. The realization hit Eleanor like physical impact. Her vision blurred at the edges. The anonymous investor. The morning meeting that never happened. It had all been a test. The hotel lobby, she whispered. You were there to meet me. I was there to observe you, Mark corrected. To see how you handled unexpected situations, how you treated people you perceived as beneath your attention, how you exercised judgment under stress. And what I observed was someone who made assumptions based on appearance, who refused to listen, who wielded authority with casual cruelty. He gestured toward the laptop. These documents confirm what I saw. Turnover rates that suggest toxic culture. Exit interviews describing leadership built on intimidation. You didn't just fail the test in that lobby, Miss Drake. You confirmed a pattern. Eleanor's composure shattered completely. Her shoulders began to shake, and she sank into the chair, her face dropping into her hands. The tears came unbidden, hot and humiliating, born of exhaustion and shame. Her breath hitched in ragged gasps as she tried to speak. I was wrong, she managed, her voice muffled and broken. I was stressed, and I was terrified about the company, and I took it out on someone I thought didn't matter. I judged you based on how you were dressed, and I didn't listen, and I was cruel for no reason except that I could be. She looked up at him, her eyes red and streaming. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know what I did. But my company has 400 employees who don't deserve to lose their jobs because their CEO is an arrogant fool. Mark leaned back, his expression softening fractionally. He let the silence hang for a moment. I'm not interested in destroying Nova Jean, he said. The science is too valuable, and you're right, the employees don't deserve to pay for leadership failures. What I am interested in is whether real change is possible. Whether someone who recognizes their mistakes can actually transform how they lead. Eleanor lifted her head, hope and fear warring in her chest. What are you saying? Mark pulled a document from the stack and slid it across the table. I'm saying that Rowan Capital is prepared to offer a conditional rescue package. $350 million in staged investment, enough to stabilize operations. But it comes with non-negotiable requirements. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for the document, her eyes scanning the text through lingering tears. First, Mark said, his tone firm, sweeping cultural reforms. Independent audits every quarter. New HR practices. Leadership training mandatory, starting with you. Second, a public apology, not a corporate statement, but you personally acknowledging what happened and what you're doing to change. Third, Novagene's board will vote on your continued role as CEO. If they decide you're not the right leader going forward, you accept that decision without challenge. Eleanor stared at the document, the words swimming slightly. It was salvation and judgment combined, a lifeline wrapped around conditions that would strip away her pride and possibly her position. But it was also a chance. She looked up at Mark, her voice steady despite the tear tracks on her face. I accept. All of it. Whatever it takes. Mark nodded once. Then we have an agreement. My legal team will contact you within 48 hours to finalize terms. But Miss Drake, understand this: if the reforms are superficial, if the apology is hollow, if this is just performance to secure funding, we will know. And the consequences then will be final. Eleanor stood, her legs still unsteady but holding. You'll see real change. I promise you that. As she turned toward the door, Mark's voice stopped her. I hope so. For everyone's sake. The Nova Gene Systems conference room had been transformed into a press venue, professional lighting rigs casting harsh illumination across the podium. Camera crews jostled for position, their equipment creating a forest of tripods. Journalists occupied every seat, recorders poised, phones held up to capture every angle. Eleanor stood behind the podium, her hands gripping the edges so tightly her knuckles had gone bloodless. She wore a navy suit, her hair pulled back severely. A single sheet of paper sat before her, but she had memorized every word. The room quieted. Eleanor lifted her gaze to the cameras and began to speak. My name is Eleanor Drake, and I am here today to address an incident that occurred 5 days ago at the Grand Langston Hotel in Seattle. Many of you have seen the video. I dismissed a man from a hotel lobby based on assumptions about his appearance and my own frustration. I refused to listen when he tried to introduce himself. That man was Mark Rowan, Chief Executive Officer of Rowan Capital, who had traveled to Seattle to evaluate Novagene's leadership. Her voice remained steady, but her jaw tightened fractionally. The cameras tracked every shift in posture. My behavior was unacceptable, Eleanor continued. It reflected a pattern of leadership built on intimidation rather than respect. I let stress and fear dictate how I treated someone I perceived as beneath my attention. I was wrong, not just in that moment, but in the culture I allowed to develop within this company. The room erupted with questions, voices overlapping. Eleanor raised one hand, requesting silence that was only partially granted. Rowan Capital has agreed to provide conditional funding. The conditions include comprehensive cultural reforms, independent audits conducted quarterly, new human resources practices, and mandatory leadership training starting with myself. These are not symbolic gestures. They are fundamental changes to how this company operates. The press conference lasted 47 minutes, each question probing for weakness. Eleanor answered them all, her composure cracking only once when asked whether she deserved to remain as CEO. The pause before her response stretched long enough that the silence itself became an answer. By the time it ended, news outlets were broadcasting clips nationally. Eleanor's face appeared on screens across the country, her admission replaying in 15-second loops. Social media exploded with commentary. 3 hours later, Novagene's board convened in emergency session. Eleanor sat in a chair positioned apart from the conference table, no longer at the head where she had presided for 12 years. Margaret Soto called the meeting to order with brisk efficiency. The vote was swift. 7 board members, 6 votes to remove Eleanor Drake as chief executive officer. Thomas Way abstained. Margaret announced the decision with clinical precision. Eleanor, you will remain with Novagene in a non-executive transition role for 6 months. During that time, you will have no operational authority. An interim CEO will be appointed within the week. Eleanor nodded, her hands folded in her lap, her spine rigid. She had known this was coming, but hearing the words spoken aloud still felt like being erased in real time. The news spread through the company's open floor plan like a shockwave. Employees gathered in clusters, voices rising and falling. Near the break room, a senior researcher spoke quietly to her team. Maybe things will actually change now. Maybe we can focus on the science instead of surviving her moods. A junior analyst looked visibly shaken, torn between sympathy and recognition that Eleanor's leadership had made his job unnecessarily difficult. An operations manager who had submitted his resignation quietly withdrew it, willing to give the company another chance. The emotional landscape was complex. Some employees felt vindicated, others uncomfortable with how publicly their CEO had been dismantled, all uncertain about what came next. In Chicago, Mark Rowan sat in his penthouse office reviewing the final investment documents. His legal team had worked through the night to structure the deal, building in protections and requirements that would force accountability. $350 million divided into staged tranches, each release contingent on meeting specific reform milestones. He signed the documents with measured strokes. Jennifer Park entered with a tablet displaying the press conference coverage, multiple news outlets running simultaneous analysis. The commitment is finalized, she said. First tranche releases tomorrow pending board certification of the interim CEO appointment. Quarterly audits begin in 90 days. Mark set down his pen. Make sure the audit team understands we're looking for genuine cultural change, not cosmetic adjustments. If they're just performing reform to secure funding, we pull out completely. Understood. And Eleanor Drake? She gets her 6 months to prove whether she meant what she said. After that, the board decides. Mark turned toward the window, his reflection ghostly against the evening sky. Sometimes people can change. Sometimes they can't. We'll know which one she is soon enough. The city lights glittered below, indifferent to the judgments and transformations unfolding within its towers. The Novagene Systems headquarters had acquired a different atmosphere over 12 months. The changes were subtle: new posters outlining transparent promotion criteria, updated handbooks, suggestion boxes that actually generated responses. But beneath these visible markers lay deeper transformations. Dr. Sarah Kim, the interim CEO, sat in the conference room reviewing quarterly data with her leadership team. Her management style stood in stark contrast to Eleanor's collaborative rather than authoritarian. The promotion metrics had been overhauled, removing subjective assessments. Now, advancement followed clear pathways based on performance reviews, peer feedback, and measurable contributions. Hiring practices had undergone similar reconstruction. Human Resources had implemented blind resume screening, structured interviews, and diverse hiring panels. The workforce demographics had begun shifting toward greater representation. In a glass-walled conference room, the quarterly audit team from Rowan Capital reviewed their findings. The lead auditor, Rebecca Torres, flipped through compiled data. Her team had spent 3 weeks conducting interviews, analyzing turnover statistics, reviewing promotion records. The numbers told a story of genuine transformation. Employee turnover had decreased by 38%. Exit interviews no longer cited hostile leadership culture. Internal surveys measuring psychological safety had climbed from the 20th percentile to the 75th. Pay disparities had been systematically corrected. Rebecca looked across the table at Sarah Kim. The data supports what we've been observing. Nova Jean has implemented meaningful cultural change. The improvements are significant and sustained. Sarah nodded, her shoulders relaxing. We still have work to do. But we're building something sustainable. In a smaller office, Eleanor Drake sat in a leadership rehabilitation session with executive coach Michael Chen. Eleanor had attended these sessions twice weekly for the past year, working through patterns of behavior that had defined her leadership. Michael reviewed her progress notes. You've shown consistent engagement. Talk to me about what's been most difficult. Eleanor's hands rested in her lap. Letting go of control. Learning to trust that things won't fall apart if I'm not directing every decision. The board meetings had become exercises in restraint. She attended as required, but sat at the periphery, speaking only when directly addressed. Gradually, she had learned to observe rather than dominate. The most transformative element had been the departmental visits. Sarah Kim had suggested them, and Eleanor had initially resisted, her pride balking. But she had agreed, and over 12 months, she had made her way through every department she had previously treated as invisible. In the research laboratories, she sat across from scientists who had endured years of her dismissive comments. They described projects abandoned midstream, discoveries nearly missed because she hadn't listened. Eleanor listened without defending herself. In operations, she heard from managers who had implemented her directives even when they knew better approaches existed, too afraid to speak up. They described the toll of working in constant fear. One conversation had stayed with Eleanor. A facilities coordinator named James Park spoke about the day he had tried to suggest a cost-saving approach. Eleanor had shut him down so completely that he had never offered another suggestion. I'm sorry, Eleanor had said. I should have listened. James nodded, accepting the apology without warmth but without hostility. I hope you've actually changed. In Chicago, Mark Rowan reviewed the quarterly audit reports with distant but attentive oversight. He maintained his position on Novagene's board, participating in major strategic decisions but leaving day-to-day operations to Sarah Kim's capable management. The investment had proven sound not just financially, though the company's value had stabilized and begun growing, but in demonstrating that meaningful cultural transformation was possible when leadership was held genuinely accountable. During a video call with Rebecca Torres, Mark asked the question that mattered most. Is the change sustainable? Are we seeing performative reform or genuine transformation? Rebecca's response was measured but positive. The structural changes are embedded now. New policies, new practices, new leadership. Eleanor Drake's participation in rehabilitation appears genuine, though whether she's truly transformed or simply complying remains an open question. But the company itself has changed fundamentally. That's what matters. Mark ended the call and stood at his window overlooking Chicago, the same view that had framed his decision to offer conditional investment a year earlier. Accountability had come at a cost: public humiliation, career disruption, forced confrontation with painful truths. But it had also created space for something better to emerge. Whether Eleanor Drake would ever lead again was uncertain. Whether she had truly changed or simply learned to perform change remained to be seen. But Nova Jean Systems had been given a second chance. And the 400 employees who worked there every day had a workplace that valued them rather than diminished them. Sometimes, Mark reflected, that was enough. The Grand Langston Hotel lobby looked exactly as it had 1 year ago: the same polished marble floors, the same leather furniture, the same revolving doors. But everything felt different now, weighted with history. Nova Jean Systems had chosen this location deliberately for its annual summit. Sarah Kim insisted that confronting the past was essential to demonstrating genuine change. The summit would showcase the company's progress, and holding it here made a statement about accountability. Mark Rowan stepped through the revolving doors at precisely 4:30. He wore a charcoal suit, his expression neutral as he entered the lobby that had witnessed his dismissal. He had taken only 3 steps when he saw her. Eleanor Drake stood near the entrance, positioned almost exactly where she had confronted him a year earlier. She wore a simple navy dress, her hands folded rather than gesturing with dismissive authority. When their eyes met, she waited. Mark crossed the distance between them. Eleanor extended her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "Mr. Rowan," she said. "Thank you for coming. I wanted to be here when you arrived. To welcome you properly this time." Mark took her hand, the handshake firm but brief. When they released, Eleanor's shoulders dropped fractionally. "Miss Drake," Mark replied, his tone carrying neither warmth nor hostility. "I appreciate the gesture." The silence between them lasted only seconds, but it contained volumes acknowledgement of what had happened here, recognition of the year of consequences that had followed. Around them, summit attendees began filtering into the lobby. "The presentation starts in 20 minutes, Eleanor said, gesturing toward the ballroom doors. "They've asked us to participate in a panel discussion about leadership transformation." Mark nodded once. "I'm prepared." They walked together toward the ballroom, not side by side but with Mark slightly ahead. Eleanor didn't try to match his pace. The ballroom had been transformed into a conference venue, with a stage flanked by screens displaying the Nova Jean logo. Several hundred chairs faced the stage, already filling with attendees. When the time came, Eleanor and Mark took their places on stage alongside Sarah Kim and 2 other panelists. The moderator, a business journalist who had covered the original incident, asked the first question. "Let's address what everyone in this room is thinking about. 1 year ago, an incident in this hotel's lobby became national news. Miss Drake, Mr. Rowan, how do we get from that moment to this one?" Eleanor leaned forward toward her microphone, her hands gripping the armrests to keep them steady. "We get here through accountability. Not the word, but the practice. I made decisions based on assumptions and stress and ego, and those decisions harmed people. Accountability meant accepting consequences, participating in genuine rehabilitation, and stepping back from power to allow better leadership to emerge." Mark's response was measured. From the investment side, accountability meant establishing conditions that forced real change. It meant quarterly audits, structural reforms, and willingness to walk away if the transformation proved superficial. Leadership failures don't repair themselves through good intentions. The panel discussion continued for 40 minutes, each question probing deeper into cultural transformation, personal costs of public failure. The role of capital in forcing accountability. Eleanor answered every question without deflection. Mark's contributions balanced skepticism with acknowledgement that meaningful change was possible. When the panel ended, attendees stood and applauded. Eleanor and Mark descended from the stage. Separately, navigating conversations before finding themselves near the lobby entrance once again as the summit concluded. Mark turned to Eleanor, his expression thoughtful rather than evaluative. The question he asked carried genuine curiosity. "What did you learn?" His voice was quiet. "Not what you're supposed to say publicly, but what actually changed for you." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, her answer emerging from genuine reflection. "I learned that authority without accountability is just permission to harm people. I learned that my assumptions about who mattered and who didn't were destroying something I claimed to care about. And I learned that redemption isn't something you achieve. It's something you practice every day by making different choices." Mark studied her face for a long moment, searching for signs of performance or manipulation. What he saw instead was exhaustion and humility, the markers of someone who had walked through fire and emerged fundamentally altered. "That's a good start," he said finally. "Keep practicing." He extended his hand one final time, and Eleanor took it, the handshake lasting a beat longer than their first exchange hours earlier. When they separated, Mark turned toward the revolving doors, stepping back into the Seattle evening without looking back. Eleanor remained in the lobby, standing in the space where her arrogance had imploded a year ago. Now holding the fragile possibility that she might build something better from the ruins. A year ago, one look was enough to judge a man. Today, a second handshake proved how wrong that can be. Never judge a person by the surface. You might be turning away the very change you need. If this resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Thank you for watching. This has been Golden Heart Stories.